Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. This is Dr. Patricia Coughlin. If you've listened to any of my videos before, you might know that I consider there to be three essential aspects of knowledge and skill that are required to be highly competent as a psychotherapist. You need to be well grounded in theory and well versed in research, not only on psychopathology, but also on normal development. And both of those, theory and research, will inform your technical interventions. So, technique, theory, and research. This is never more important than when it comes to the issue of trauma. Trauma has become a buzzword. It's become very popular as kind of an explanation for why people are suffering the way they are. And if you just rely on your clinical skills and experience, it's very easy to get a distorted view of things because you're only seeing people who aren't able to manage and become symptomatic following, traumatic events. And so, in fact, many make the causational error of thinking that trauma somehow caused psychopathology. Well, do you know there's not a shred of scientific evidence to support that notion? In fact, human beings fall sort of along a bell-shaped curve when it comes to response to trauma, and resilience and recovery are the norm. There was a study done in New York City following 9/11. We had assumed there was going to be a massive outbreak of PTSD, and in fact, it never happened. The research suggested that 65% of New Yorkers who were exposed to the traumatic events of 9/11 had either 0 or 1 symptom 6 months after the event. Even first responders, so police and fire and EMTs who were really in the thick of it and seeing the most gruesome results of 9/11, over 50% of them completely recovered and were resilient and had either no symptoms or, again, only 1 symptom 6 months later. So this is, in fact, the norm. So the people that you're seeing in your practice are not the norm. So again, don't think they're anxious and depressed and whatever, they're presenting because of what happened. It's because of how they deal with their intense feelings about what happened and also what they made it mean. So I have some specific examples. One is from a clinical situation, and the other is actually a very dear friend of mine who has had way more than her share of extremely traumatic events. She was raised with a mentally disturbed, a mentally ill sibling. Her father committed suicide by gassing himself in the family's garage. Then her husband was hit by a car. She was with him. They were crossing the street. This guy came from around the corner, hit him. He went flying and had massive injuries, which required months of hospitalization. And this is while she had 2 young children also at home. And then finally, her brother-in-law was killed on 9/11. And yet, despite all of these horrendous experiences, she is one of the most resilient, compassionate, sensitive human beings I've ever known. And in fact, we might even wonder if, again, being raised with a mentally ill sibling, having a father commit suicide, there is this phenomenon called post-traumatic growth, where people who are exposed to trauma end up being stronger, more resilient, and having more meaning in their life than before these events. And that leads me to this other example. In my clinical practice, I had two middle-aged women, and they both lost a child in very, very traumatic ways. One in a horrendous accident, and the other by suicide. So if we just look at it at its face, you would think the mother whose 17-year-old son shot himself in the head would have a harder time even than someone whose child was killed in an accident. And yet that was not the case. Not, of course, both of them had all kinds of intense mixed feelings, but the mother of the child who was killed in the accident made the death of her child mean that her life was over and that she would never be happy again. How could she be if a child had died? And so that her became self-fulfilling. Whereas the mother of the child who had committed suicide decided to, he was actually the fourth kid in their school district who had committed suicide that year. She decided to do something about it. And she went to a university that had, it's called a teen screen program. She got trained and certified, brought it back to the school. And then she said, I don't want to make suicide, my main focus. She did that. She put it in operation in the schools, and then she pulled out. It turns out she had an intuition that something was happening with her son, and called the police, and they were able to get there, unfortunately, too late, but very soon after his death. And so they medevaced him to a hospital, put him on life support, and they were able to donate many of his organs. And she has actually met the person who received his heart, his liver, and his kidneys. And so she has an enormous sense of meaning that allows her not just to survive, but to thrive despite the heartache. It's not to say, right, that you're not going to have incredible feelings of grief and guilt and everything else. But it's, again, the way those feelings are dealt with and what you make it mean. And that's the good news, because that's what we can help our patients with. They're suffering, again, not because of what happened, but because of how they're dealing with their feelings about what happened and what they made it mean. So it's very important that you understand that as a clinician, that you acquaint yourself with the research on this so that you're clear about it, and then you can help the patient with their feelings and the meaning. And by the way, it's George Bonanno at Columbia, I believe, who's done an enormous amount of research on this. And again, the conclusion is quite clear that resilience and recovery without intervention is the most common response to trauma. It's also important to recognize that after 9/11, since we thought everybody would get incredibly disordered after trauma, they forced first responders in many cases to talk to therapists, to get into groups and open up about their feelings. And there was a significant number of these people who got worse after that experience, right? So they weren't intervening based on data and based on people not being able to work it through, instead of letting people recover in their own way and only intervene with those who couldn't bounce back. So I hope this is helpful to you. I hope it piques your interest and that you'll do some research so that you understand not only pathological responses, but you really understand what the norm is when it comes to response to trauma. Thanks. Bye-bye.